Hi, and welcome to The Greatest Lies in History podcast, a riveting podcast that dives deep into the world of con artists who manipulated historical narratives to their advantage. I'm your host, Kimberly Desmond.
And I'm your co-host, Patrick Pichler. We are two history students from Vienna with a love for all things that deal with historical scandals and controversy. Each episode of this podcast unpacks the intricate schemes, psychology behind deception, and the consequences of these fabrications on our understanding of history. It explores how lies can shape societies, influence politics, and alter the course of history itself.
In today's episode, we will examine the bizarre story of Edmund Backhouse, a British con artist whose false claim to have insider knowledge of China led to the publication of a sensational biography of the Empress Dowager Cixi in 1910. Set against the backdrop of the late 19th century China, Backhouse's narrative not only misrepresented the Empress Dowager Cixi's life, but also shaped Western perceptions of Chinese history well until the 1980s. We'll delve into how he was able to fabricate his story, the political climate of the time, and the impact of his lives on both historical scholarship and public opinion. So without further ado, let's take a trip to China in the late 1800s, where we will get to know mysterious characters, their schemes and plans to create what we would call fake history today. So let's start with the book that kicked off this entire scandal, China Under the Empress Dowager. Published in 1910, just 2 years after the Empress Dowager Cixi's death, it was written by Sir Edmund Backhouse and John Otway Percy Bland.
And it wasn't just any book, was it? This biography quickly became a sensation. It wasn't just well received, it was celebrated as a groundbreaking source on the Chinese Empire, offering what seemed like unparalleled insights into Cixi's life, the Manchu rulers, and the Qing government.
Exactly. What's particularly striking are the details of the narrative. The book traces Cixi's life from her early childhood through her rise as a concubine to the Emperor of China, and finally to her years as the ruler herself of one of the largest empires in history.
Cixi ruled for an astonishing 47 years, which makes her the longest-serving female ruler in Chinese history to that day. But the way her story was presented in this book cast a long shadow over her legacy.
The book wasn't just a dry recounting of facts. It was written in a very elegant, detailed, and deeply personal style. That kind of storytelling made it incredibly engaging. It felt authentic, especially because it claimed to be based on multiple language sources and first-hand accounts.
And here's where it gets even more compelling, or suspicious depending on how you look at it. The book's credibility was anchored in one key source, the so-called Jingshan diary, allegedly written by Jingshan, who was the comptroller of Cixi's household. This diary was supposedly discovered by Backhouse himself. According to him, it had been abandoned in Jingshan's house during the chaos of the Boxer movement.
And that's where the real drama begins. The diary wasn't just an old document, it was claimed to offer intimate, never-before-seen details about the Empress Dowager Cixi, the Qing court, and the tumultuous political climate of the time. But it wasn't flattering. In fact, it described Cixi as manipulative, emotional, and materialistic, someone who was power-hungry and entirely unfit to rule an empire.
Which was quite a devastating portrayal, don't you think? Remember, this was a time when Western audiences were already predisposed to view China through an exoticized and often derogatory lens. This narrative fed perfectly into those biases.
100%, and it wasn't just about reputation. This book had far-reaching consequences. It influenced how scholars, politicians, and the public in the West understood the Qing dynasty, and Cixi's role in it, for decades, well into the 1980s.
It's very astonishing when you think about this. A single book, based largely on one questionable source, shaped perceptions of an entire period in Chinese history.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive deeper into the fabrication and its fallout, let's step back and look at these two men responsible for this monumental scandal.
Yes, indeed. Because understanding who they were and what might have motivated them is crucial to unravel this mystery.
Let's take a closer look at the men at the heart of the story. Sir Edmund Backhouse. He was born in England in 1873 into an influential Quaker family, but his life was far from the picture of stability that you might expect.
That's putting it mildly. During his student years, Backhouse racked up a significant amount of debt. Rather than face the consequences, he fled Britain in 1899 and ended up in China.
And in China, he found a fresh start, or at least the appearance of one. He began working as a translator for George Ernest Morrison, a British journalist for the Times. Morrison actually had some pretty high praise for him, describing Backhouse as an, quote, exceptionally gifted fellow.
Right. Morrison even noted that Backhouse could read, write, and speak multiple languages, including modern Greek and Russian, and that he knew an impressive 3,000 Chinese characters.
But here's where things get a little murky. Backhouse claimed to have, quote, inside information about the Qing court, but no evidence ever surfaced to prove he had connections with anyone significant there.
And yet, he stuck to the story, insisting that he had an unnamed source feeding him all this insider knowledge. It's fascinating how convincing he must have been to maintain this facade.
Oh, 100%. And during this time, Morrison introduced Backhouse to John Ottaway Percy Bland, another British journalist for the Times. This introduction would eventually lead to their collaboration on China under the Empress Dowager.
But first, the two of them made headlines in a different way. Bland and Backhouse were the ones who reported on Empress Dowager Cixi's death in 1908 for the Times.
And Bland, what an interesting character he was. His reporting often reflected his aggressive stance on Chinese and British politics. He was eventually recalled to Britain in 1910 because of his controversial views.
And those views didn't soften over time. In his later works, Bland became increasingly critical of China's nationalism, its republican movement, and also the societal changes that followed with it, including the fall of the Qing dynasty and with it, the Chinese Empire.
But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. After Cixi's death in 1908, Bland proposed the idea of writing a biography about her. Backhouse, who by this point had established himself as quite something of a China expert, was brought on board to supply the so-called documentary material.
And that's how this infamous partnership began. Backhouse provided the primary sources and translations for the book, while Bland brought his sharp, though heavily biased, perspective.
And together, they set out to write a tell-all biography of the Empress Dowager Cixi, one that would shock and captivate Western readers.
And boy, oh boy, did they succeed, though not in the way they might have hoped once the truth came to light.
Exactly. But before we get to that fallout, let's dig a little deeper into what made their collaboration so potent and so problematic. Let's talk about the actual context of China under the Empress Dowager. The biography presented itself as a chronological account of Cixi's life, supposedly based on state decrees, first-hand accounts from people at court, and most notably the infamous Qingshan Diary.
Ah yes, the Qingshan Diary, a document that played a central role in the book's credibility. According to Backhouse, Qingshan was a comptroller in the Qing court from 1865 to 1894, and this diary contained intimate details about Cixi's reign and the court's inner workings.
Backhouse claimed that he found this diary during the Boxer movement, which took place between 1899 and 1901. He said he discovered it in Qingshan's private study on August 18th, though the exact year remained very vague.
And the discovery itself sounds like something out of a movie, doesn't it? Backhouse said he saved the diary just before 6 soldiers set the comptroller's house on fire. It's very dramatic, but also a little bit suspicious, don't you think?
Definitely. What's even more curious is that Backhouse claimed he kept the diary for 9 years without realizing its significance. It wasn't until Bland suggested writing the biography that Backhouse mysteriously decided that it might be useful after all.
How convenient. And by centering the book around the diary, they gave their work instant credibility. After all, who wouldn't believe a first-hand, detailed account of events during the Boxer Rising?
But here's the catch. The diary wasn't flattering to Cixi at all. It portrayed her as a ruthless, power-hungry leader who would stop at nothing to maintain control, even resorting to murder.
It's such a damning portrayal, and it resonated with Western audiences at the time. The press praised the book as a groundbreaking source, calling it one of the most authoritative accounts of China's mysterious imperial court.
And that perception lasted for decades. Even into the 1980s, many scholars considered the diary to be a legitimate source despite growing suspicion about its authenticity.
Wow. It's really wild and disturbing to think how long such a forgery went unquestioned, shaping the historical narrative of Cixi and the Boxer uprising entirely.
Absolutely, and it all started with Backhouse's dramatic claim of discovering the diary during the chaos of the Boxer movement. But as we'll see, the truth behind the so called discovery was far less heroic. So let's unpack what the Qingshan diary supposedly revealed. According to Backhouse, it included detailed accounts of events during the Boxer Rebellion and the eight-nation allied invasion of Beijing. These are very pivotal moments in Chinese history.
Absolutely. For some context, the Boxers were a group of rebels who emerged in the late 19th century with a mission to expel foreigners and eradicate Christianity from China. By 1899, they had launched a violent campaign targeting Christian missionaries and Chinese converts. They believed foreign influence was the root of all of China's problems.
And so violence quickly spread across northern China, with Beijing becoming the epicenter of conflict. For the Empress Dowager Cixi, this uprising presented an opportunity. She saw it as a way to reclaim China's sovereignty and push back against the foreign powers that had been exerting influence through unequal treaties for decades.
But her decision to support the Boxer movement wasn't just about national pride. It was about maintaining her own power. At the time, the Qing court was divided between reformers and conservatives. Backing the Boxers allowed her to assert control over the court, but it also set the stage for a catastrophic confrontation with the world's major powers of the time.
By June 1900, the Boxers had surrounded the legation quarters of Beijing, where foreign nationals were sheltering. The situation was dire, and the foreign powers were desperate to act.
Now it's time to enter for the Eight-Nation Alliance, a coalition that included Japan, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the United States, Italy, and, yes, also Austria-Hungary. They decided to send military forces to crush the Boxer uprising once and for all and to protect their citizens.
And they didn't waste any time. By August 1900, the Allied forces had reached Beijing and captured the city. The foreigners took control, and the Empress Dowager Cixi was forced to flee the capital. She stayed in exile for 18 months, finally returning to Beijing in 1902. But what's interesting is how much effort she made afterwards to repair China's relationship with the West and embrace modernization.
That's indeed a very important point. Backhouse's version of events portrays her involvement in the Boxer uprising as far more sinister than it actually was. For example, he claimed that Cixi ordered the mass execution of all foreigners, men, women, and children, during the uprising. But there's no evidence to support this claim. This theme of Cixi's supposed hatred and aggression toward foreigners runs throughout the entire biography, but it's a gross exaggeration. In reality, after returning to court in 1902, she worked hard to modernize China and foster better relations with the West.
And she had some very close ties with foreign diplomats and their wives. She regularly hosted them in the Forbidden City, which is the Imperial Palace in the heart of Beijing. She even had her portrait painted in 1903 by American artist Catherine Carl. And according to the historian Zheng Shang, Cixi had a personal stake in making China more like the West. When she envoys abroad, they reported back on the freedom Western women enjoyed, things like unbound feet, public outings with their husband, and even dancing.
And that's where one of her most enduring legacies comes in. Cixi is best known today for banning foot binding, a cruel and painful practice that stunted women's foot growth and often caused lifelong orthopedic issues. Yet despite these progressive reforms, Backhouse and Blount depicted her as a superstitious, ritual-obsessed leader. Their portrayal ignored the incredible obstacles she overcame to rise to power.
Exactly. Cixi was a Manchu noblewoman from the Yihinara clan, an ethnic minority in China, and she stated as one of the emperor's lowest-ranking concubines, her rise to power was nothing short of remarkable.
It really was, indeed. Concubinage, as you need to know, was a formalized relationship in imperial China, but it rarely offered a path to power. Cixi's story defied those norms and showed just how shrewd and determined she was.
And yet, Backhouse and Bland twisted her narrative to fit their own agenda, overshadowing her accomplishments and focusing instead on unfounded rumors and stereotypes.
Which is what makes this history so infuriating. and at the same time so fascinating. It's a testament to how much influence a single narrative can have, especially when it's built on lies. Let's dive deeper into how Cixi rose to power and how Backhouse and Blunt twisted that story into their own narrative.
Cixi's rise was rooted in the institution of concubinage, which was formalized in China up until the 20th century. While it might seem restrictive to us today, concubinage came with rights and obligations, and in Cixi's case, it offered a path to influence. And that path was through motherhood. As mother of the emperor's only son, she gained significant status. When her husband, the emperor, died, she staged a coup to oust the 8 male regents who were supposed to oversee her son's reign. That was the beginning of her extraordinary political career.
It's quite incredible, really. During her reign, she gave orders from behind the curtain, as it was forbidden for her to have face-to-face contact with the man carrying out her directives and orders. Yet, despite this restriction, she controlled the court with remarkable skill. In contrast to that, her son Tongxi was, unfortunately, not really interested in ruling. Historians like Yung Chang note that he was more preoccupied with his personal pleasures, frequenting male and female prostitutes outside the Forbidden City very frequently. He died at just 18 years old. Rumors tell that it was because of a disease that he contracted during one of his sexual intercourses.
Well, that's unfortunate. That's when Cixi adopted her sister's 3-year-old daughter and made him emperor. By ruling through the boy known as Guangxu Emperor, she secured her position of power once again. But here's also the point where Backhouse and Bland's narrative becomes particularly vicious. They questioned whether Cixi ever truly had the right to rule, given her Manchu heritage and her initial standing as a low-ranking concubine.
They even went so far as to claim that she murdered her own husband, the emperor, to seize power, and that she had inappropriate relations with her adoptive son to maintain control. There's no evidence for any of this, of course. It's just pure fabrication.
And it didn't even stop there. Backhouse and Bland depicted Cixi as a leader fueled by corruption and chaos. They described her as having a childish lack of moral sense, which couldn't further be from the truth. In reality, Cixi brought medieval China into the modern age. As Zhongshang highlights, she introduced electricity, railways, telegrams, and modern mining. She also modernized business practices, established diplomatic relations, created a navy, and laid the foundation for a modern educational system.
And let's not forget, she banned some of the most horrific practices that you can imagine when you get the death penalty, like death by 1,000 cuts. This was a method of execution that involved slicing a person to their literal death. These were significant reforms for that time.
Ugh. And yet, Backhouse suggests that Cixi's reign was a major factor in the collapse of the Qing dynasty. He painted her as stubborn and resistant to modernization, which supposedly left China vulnerable to foreign invasion and internal rebellion. His portrayal also leaned heavily on sexist stereotypes. Backhouse and Bland's describing Cixi's decision as driven by emotion and swiftly changing moods. They labeled her materialistic, claiming she had a feminine love for luxury.
These descriptions not only reinforced sexist and exoticist narratives, but also fit into a broader Western portrayal of Cixi as a tyrannical ruler concerned only with her own power, not the welfare of her people. And the credibility of their claims hinged on the Jingshan diary. But, as you might expect, suspicions about its authenticity arose almost immediately after the biography was published.
Critics pointed out several inconsistencies. For example, certain phrases in the diary were clearly European idioms or metaphors, things a Chinese court official would have never used. Some scholars even noticed that phrases appeared to have been lifted from public memorials, and sinologists criticized the grammar as inauthentic. Despite these valid criticisms, Backhouse dismissed them all. He accused Chinese scholars of being too biased or angry to provide a neutral assessment of the diary. It was a convenient way to shut down dissent.
But as we will see, the cracks in Backhouse's story only widened over time, eventually exposing one of the most elaborate forgeries in historical scholarship. Let's talk about how the truth behind Backhouse's claims eventually came to light. The turning point came when historian Trevor Hugh Roper was given Backhouse's diary to write a biography, and Roper immediately started noticing inconsistencies, didn't he? For starters, Backhouse never had the close access to Empress Dowager Cixi or the Qing court that he claimed.
Exactly. It turned out that most of Backhouse's time in Beijing was spent in isolation. He wasn't mingling with court officials or gathering insider information. Many of the supposedly first-hand accounts in the book were actually taken from other sources, distorted, or outright invented. And then there was the salacious details, those wild accusations of murder, incest, and political conspiracies. None of them were grounded in evidence. They were based on hearsay and pure speculation. The most glaring example was of Backhouse's account of Cixi's death. He claimed that she had been involved in a power struggle and had possibly poisoned the emperor. But historical evidence shows that both Cixi and the empire died of natural causes. There's no proof of any conspiracy.
What's astonishing is how much damage these fabrications caused. China, under the Empress Dowager, painted Cixi as a power-hungry, morally questionable figure who played a significant role in China's decline. And this narrative really stuck. For decades, Western perceptions of Cixi were shaped by the lies in Backhouse's book. She became this caricature of a cruel and tyrannical ruler, even though her real legacy was far more complex, and often positive.
Thankfully, modern historians are working to dismantle this myth. They're presenting a more balanced and accurate portrayal of Cixi, highlighting her role as a reformer who brought the significant changes to China. But the fact that Backhouse's narrative endured for so long is a cautionary tale. It shows how easily history can be shaped or distorted by the personal agendas of those who wrote it.
It's a reminder that as historians, or even just as readers of history, we need to question our sources and look beyond the surface of any narrative.
Absolutely, and Backhouse's story is one of the most striking examples of how dangerous it can be to have lies become the foundation of historical scholarship.
A real fascinating and sobering lesson to end on. So, what's next for the Greatest Lies in History podcast?
Well, you'll have to wait and see, but trust me, the next episode will be just as riveting. And until then, remember to question the stories you hear and don't believe everything you read.
We'll talk more about that next time, here in The Greatest Lies in History. Stay tuned.